Thank you for having us. Can you hear us at the back? Give us a wave if you can hear us. Great stuff. So I'm going to talk to you today about responding to complexity and this idea of the human learning systems approach. But I'm going to kind of scrap off the first 3 slides and want to respond a little bit to some of the things I've heard today, because some of the things I've heard today, I think you have a public management problem. We have a public management problem in that local area coordination, as I've heard this morning, is about love. It's about human relationships, right? And your current public management mechanisms asks you to metricize love. It asks you to prove the value of human beings having relationships to one another. Now, if your management method is asking you to prove the value of human beings having relationships with each other, the problem is with the management method, not with your work. So, what I'm going to talk to you about is an alternative to the type of management method that asks you to prove the value of human relationships. Because that management method has a name. It's an ideology called New Public Management, and it was created in the 80s and 90s. It is not the way to manage. There are many different ways to manage, and people can choose to manage differently. So I'm going to talk to you about the people who have chosen to manage differently. And what I think that creates as an opportunity for local area coordination is it means that you're not having to fight against a management system that makes it intrinsically more difficult to value the work that you're doing. So, where does this journey start? It starts, for me, in valuing complexity. Because our assertion is that complexity is important because it describes the fundamental processes by which the outcomes we care about are made. And so what we're saying is, if we fail to understand and embrace complexity, we won't be able to create the outcomes that we seek. And it's this insight that gives us a way in to thinking about an alternative public management mechanism. Because our current public management mechanism isn't robust. It doesn't create efficient outcomes. But understanding complexity does give a robust alternative that enables people to create outcomes with better value. So, how do we understand and visualize complexity? Who's familiar with this diagram? Hands up if you know what this diagram is. Right. This is a systems map of obesity created by the Government Foresight Office in 2007. So what happens if you shut a bunch of public health experts in a room and say, you're not allowed out till you map all the causes of obesity and all the relationships between all of those causes? So they found 108 different causes of obesity. You can't see them on this diagram, they're too small, but you can see them lumped together in areas like early life experiences, food production and supply, macroeconomic drivers, education, the media, the technology, the nature of work, the built environment. Down here in the bottom right-hand corner, healthcare and treatment options. 4 factors out of 108 that lead to the outcome of whether people are obese or not. What this diagram shows is that the outcome of obesity, any outcome that we choose, is the product of a whole system working together. Right? This is why complexity is important, because it describes the processes by which outcomes are made. It makes us realize that outcomes are not delivered by organizations. They're not delivered by programs. They're not delivered by things we fund and commission. Outcomes are emergent properties of complex systems. They are the product of the whole system working together. So if we want to help create good outcomes in people's lives, we need to enable these systems to work together better. This is the basis of doing public management differently. So, what does complexity require of us in terms of how we do public management? It means it requires that we respond to variety, because each person's strengths and needs are different. And so if we want to help create good outcomes in people's lives, we need to understand and respond to the way that, if you're trying to create well-being in my life, it's different from yours and from yours and from yours and from yours. Each one of us is different. If we want to create good outcomes, we need to understand that difference. Secondly, it means we need to adapt the ability to adapt to change, because the context in which the interventions we make happen is constantly changing. And therefore, the success of those interventions, which is a relationship between the work that is done and the wider context, is also changing. So our interventions need to be able to keep up with the constantly changing nature of the world. The big things, Brexit, the small things, like changing someone's family circumstances. And finally, if we're going to create outcomes in the real world, not in some simplified management fantasy, we need to be able to shape systems whose behavior we can't reliably predict and which no one controls, because that's the nature of the world. So, this is what we've been trying to look at for the last kind of 3 or 4 years. How do we do public management differently to respond to that complex variety? And we've got a couple of reports on this. First one from May 2017. This one, the second one, Exploring the New World, from May this year. And what we've done in that is we've worked alongside public and voluntary sector organisations, public sector commissioners, charitable foundations, organisations working on the ground to see how they are doing things differently. So what I'm going to talk to you about, this alternative approach we call human learning systems, comes from the practice that organisations are doing. It comes from the reality of the alternatives of the way people are working. So, what we want to say is that funding, commissioning, and managing in complexity involves a human learning systems approach, and I'll dig into each of those 3 ideas in turn. Firstly, I don't need to tell you about the value of being human. All that you do is about being human to one another, to recognise the variety of human need and experience, to use empathy to understand each other's strengths and needs across that difference. To view people from a strengths-based perspective. They're not just a person with mental health problems or a person who's experienced homelessness. They bring all of themselves to every encounter that you have. And the way that the managerial response to that needs to be trust. Because as we've heard really eloquently for a bunch of people this morning, unless you trust people in the work and the people themselves at the sharp end of this, they are the only people who can know what good looks like in their lives. So if you want to make good decisions about what happens in their lives, you need to trust the people who know. And that isn't the managers, because they're not close enough. The only people who know enough about that situation to make good decisions about what should happen are the people themselves and the workers who have a strong relationship with them. What does this mean in terms of funding practice for funders and commissioners? It means long-term funding, because if you're going to talk about funding relationships, then relationships need to last a long time. It means funding without performance measures, without KPIs. It means core or unrestricted funding. And if you think that sounds like a fantasy, let me tell you, Plymouth, CCG, and Council have just created a £80 million 10-year commission for a whole system to support adults with complex needs. No KPIs, no targets, based on trusting the organisations that they work with and holding them accountable for learning and for collaborating together. This is what this alternative, the human learning systems approach, looks like in practice. For people managing the work, it means that the job of social interventions, this stuff you know, is to hear and understand the strengths and needs of the people that are being served and respond appropriately to whatever those strengths and needs are. That is the job of all public service, not just local or area coordination. Like I say, for other audiences, I dig into this a bit more. You know this stuff. So that's the human bit, learning. What the learning aspect says is that learning needs to be a continuous process throughout the design and the delivery of work. Let's contrast that with how learning is thought of at the moment. At the moment, learning is thought of as a phase in social innovation. So we start with a problem, a prompt in this young foundation diagram, and we learn and experiment in order to solve that problem. So we produce proposals, we do prototypes, and when we find what works, we've done the learning, the job is then to take that to scale. So we learn and experiment, we find what works, and we do more of that. Trouble is, in a complex environment, that's just the wrong strategy. that strategy does not work in a complex environment. Because in a complex environment, in the dynamic world that's actually the reality out there, learning needs to be a continuous process. Because the world is constantly changing. So what works is constantly changing. In fact, there is no such thing as what works at a programmatic level. That's not how evidence functions in a complex system. And anyone who tries to tell you different doesn't understand the epistemology of working in complex systems. The thing that works in a complex system is a continuous process of learning. The moment your intervention stops learning is the moment it stops working. For funders and managers, what that means is that commissioners need to purchase the capacity for organizations to learn and adapt. So that is what is required from a public management approach that responds effectively to complexity, that promotes learning rather than the delivery of results. So we know that learning is enabled by funding for learning rather than funding for results. Creating a learning culture, which means removing competition between organizations, so organizations don't treat their knowledge as their unique selling point, but why would we share that with anyone else? It means creating a positive error culture, which is just a bit of jargon that says, round here we talk about our mistakes and our uncertainties. Because if you're working in a complex environment, everyone is feeling uncertain every day about what the right thing to do is. And if you don't create an environment as a manager or as a leader that people can talk about those mistakes and uncertainties with their peers, how is anyone going to learn? And finally, I just want to highlight this idea of using data to learn. Because it's really, really, really important to measure well, but you cannot use that data to prove your effectiveness to others, because people just game it if you try. Tons of evidence about this. It all says the same thing. As soon as you try and use data for accountability purposes, people game it. So you use data to learn and improve rather than to prove your effectiveness to others. Human learning systems. So this starts from the assumption that we looked at earlier, that healthy systems produce better outcomes. So a healthy system being a system in which the different actors in that system can coordinate and collaborate together. That creates two questions. Firstly, who's looking after the health of the system? Who is it that is ensuring in a local place that actors in that system can coordinate and collaborate effectively? We call this role system stewardship. And so is that what you do as local area coordinators? Are local area coordinators the infrastructure that enables healthy systems to function? That's just a question that I wanted to pose you. Second question, if it's a system steward job to create a healthy system, to nurture a healthy system, what does a healthy system look like? Well, there's lots of potential answers to that. The Lankelly Chase Foundation have been working with a bunch of their partners, organizations who do on-the-ground thinkers. They've come up with a set of system behaviors that give and answers the question, what does a healthy system look like? And there will be a bunch of things you recognize. So a healthy system, for example, is one in which power is shared and equality of voice is actively promoted. A healthy system is where people view themselves as part of an interconnected whole. So actors in the system see and understand that they are part of something bigger and know their role in relationship to those others. I won't go through all of those. So again, question I want to ask you, is it useful to think about the role of local area coordinators as system stewards? As people whose job it is to help ensure and create that kind of healthy system? If it is, we've got some interesting examples of people and places using those system behaviors as indicators. So what people did is they asked questions of people. We did some research. Do people around here view themselves as part of an interconnected whole? Could you give a score out of 10 for that? And could you tell us a story about it? Is power shared? Is equality of voice actively promoted? Could you give us that score? Could you tell us a story? That gives you a picture of a place and how those system behaviors are existing or not right now in the place. And this, if you're a system steward, could say, where's the work that we need to do? Oh, look, people do not think that power is shared and equality of voice is actively promoted around here, what will we do to increase that? What will we do? What work is needed to be done to ensure that equality of voice is actively promoted? And you know what that work looks like, right? Because it's not rocket science. So, can these system behaviors give an indication of the work that is required to create healthy systems? Just a question I wanted to ask you. So what are we trying to do with all this stuff, with the human learning system stuff? We're trying to build a movement so that when people in 5 years' time think about how they would manage the next series of interventions, how they would allocate resources, how they would plan, they would think, why not use a human learning systems approach? Why would we use that crazy new public management stuff? So what we're doing is we're doing research into what the human learning systems practice looks like. What does it mean? Because each organization that is trying this is creating their own version of what the approach looks like. There is all sorts of experiments with human learning systems practice happening in all parts of the country. Could you do it? Could you be part of that experimentation? What can you do? If this has any resonance for you, it might not, then you can use. Does it help for you to use the language of human learning systems? Because the more people speak this, the more the paradigm changes. Can you act as a champion? Can you use your leverage for others to say, why are you managing like that? Why shouldn't we manage it like this? Can you manage using this human learning systems approach? And what would it mean for you to do it? And if it's interesting, you can join with a bunch of others. There's over 330 leaders from across the world, mostly UK-based, who are asking each other questions about how to do this on this Knowledge Hub forum. The link is there. So my final question to you, what would it look like for you to adopt this as your way of doing management? Thanks very much.